we're here for a couple reasons. One of those reasons being that 100 years ago, Gertrude Stein wrote this book called Tinder Buttons. And another of those reasons being that I made this little book about that book this year. And so I was thinking about ways to talk about Gertrude Stein's Tinder Buttons, which supposedly we're going to talk about. And I thought about one way that might happen would be this nice introduction to who Gertrude Stein was and when she wrote and why that was important when she wrote and things that were going on around that time. But then I thought that there were other ways to talk about what we're doing here. And so I started reading about the 1992 film Encino Man, which I haven't seen. It stars Brendan Fraser and Pauly Shore. And the blurb that Rotten Tomatoes has for this movie is, when they find a frozen caveman in their backyard, two high school outcasts thaw him and introduce him to modern life, while he in turn gets them to actually enjoy life. This movie has an 18% positive rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
I remember liking it.
Chris liked it. The New York Times said, with his tousled hair, high tops, and wide-eyed stare, Brendan Fraser turns into the coolest guy at Encino High. He dances around the halls and turns into a perfect hip-hopper without even trying. He makes primitive cave drawings on a computer. And I like Encino Man for thinking about what we do with things that come from a long time ago, or not so long ago, like 100 years ago, and like what we do with Gertrude Stein's book when we find it and do something with it. Because finding a caveman and taking him to American high school in 1992 is like one thing that you can do with things from the past that has nothing to do with the history of that thing. And there's other things, like there's other ways that movie can be made, and I can imagine like really, really awful versions or worse versions of Encino Man that Chris wouldn't have liked, where instead of like seeing what's awesome about a caveman in high school, you try to like track down the caveman's roots. And like you go through this thing where you care about where the caveman came from and you try to figure it out. And like maybe at some point you have this really awful scene where the caveman is sitting with his great grandson, and you realize that like they both have the same posture and they're both eating an apple in the same way. And it's this thing about genealogy, and maybe like Steven Spielberg makes that movie. And that's the introduction where I tell you about Gertrude Stein and where she came from and her history. And that's the one that we're not doing tonight. Stein's really weird, and the reception of Stein is really weird and has been really weird. From the introduction of, so there's a new edition of Tinder Buttons out from City Lights, and there's a stack of them over there. And one of the weirdest parts of planning this event was that at one point the editor of that book, who's he's a literature professor, I think in Oklahoma, was going to fly to this event. And I thought that was really bizarre, and I like, why is he going to do that? And it ended up falling through. But that would have been a very different event. It would have been strange and weird. But the introduction to that book is actually really good. And it kind of gets at some of the things that I like about Stein, and I think this event is going to kind of think about with Stein. So Perla, editor there, says, Stein's politics make little consistent sense. She was, after all, a Jewish lesbian interested in the work of Otto Weininger, the author of anti-Semitic, homophobic, and misogynistic works. Interpretations of Tinder Buttons, this book, have been crazy. William Gass said that it was full of dildos. Other people have claimed that this book was about oral sex with a circumcised penis, a clitoris rubbed with a rubber cock. People have argued over whether the title refers to nipples or a plant's buds, and plenty of people have said kind of boring things about whether or not Gertrude Stein was stoned when she wrote it. Her partner, Alice B. Toklas, writes a cookbook several years after this, and it kind of famously has a recipe for pot brownies in it, which is all kind of like neither here nor there. But later in this introduction, Perlow writes, these readings make clear that it is not that Tinder Buttons is unreadable, not that it is too difficult, but rather that it is an optimistic demonstration of how possible it is to read, of how, luckily, our imaginations are impossible to regulate and restrict, of how it might not be possible to find something unreadable. So, with this book, and especially with the event that we're doing tonight, I think it's fun to take Tinder Buttons as like the caveman who shows up and goes to high school, and we don't care where it came from, but we see what Brendan Fraser can do as a caveman. So I asked my friend Christopher Ledesma, who's a musician, what he could do with these poems, and what could be made of them with some instruments and some things that we have in 2014, like a looping pedal, and what we might learn about the poetry and the words that way. And so maybe kind of asking questions like, what is it that makes a caveman a good time traveler? What is it about Brendan Fraser that makes him good in a 1992 high school? Also, maybe like, what will we do with Pauly Shore or Encino Man in 100 years? What good will Pauly Shore be in 100 years? And also, like, what can we do with Gertrude Stein in 2014? So we're going to do some music stuff for you guys, and then we have cake afterwards. So thank you again for coming.